Um, Again, hello, I'm Steve Schwartz, and I'm delighted to have as our virtual speaker today, Peter Minnett. I got to know Peter, I think, the first time around when he was a member of the oceanography group at Brookhaven National Laboratory, and it was really quite a world-class group in those days, and unfortunately got terminated by DOE, and all that talent got dispersed in a whole bunch of different directions. But a lot of people whose names uh, oceanography people might recognize. Oh, was that person at Brookhaven? Oh, is that person at Brookhaven? So it was really quite a good group in those days. Um, I asked Peter for a bit of a bio. He started out got a degree in physics, which is always a good credential at Oxford, and then went to Southampton, getting a PhD in physical oceanography. To then went to Kiel, Germany, at an institution I don't recognize called the Christian Albrechts University in Kiel, and then joined Brookhaven National Laboratory in 1990. And subsequently in 1995 went to RISMAS, Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Miami, where he really made a very distinguished career and graduated to emeritus just a few years ago. Peter, back when I was involved in the ARM program, was sort of my go-to guy about questions of atmospheric radiation. Well, look, isn't snow black in the IR? Can't you just use sigma t to the fourth and epsilon equal to 1? Well, not exactly. And sort of his standard answer to any sort of a question was not exactly. And then there's all kinds of measurement issues. You're measuring radiance, and how do you get an irradiance out of that? Well, you're really measuring the skin temperature of the ocean. You're not really measuring the same thing that a thermometer is going to measure if you stick the thermometer in there. And that skin temperature, that's going to be influenced by radiation in and out. It's going to be influenced by evaporation in and out. So not exactly. That was kind of the standard answer that I would get from Peter. And it looks like sort of that not exactness has persisted into the title of today's talk, Satellite Remote Sensing of Surface Temperatures in the Arctic, Problems and Some Solutions. And I guess that the complement of that is some yet unresolved problems, which will keep us in business for a while. So please, we're delighted to have Peter. Welcome, and we're very happy to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Steve. I'm very happy to be able to share some of the issues that I've been working on for several years now. And as you say, the solutions are not exactly ready yet. But why do we? Oh, no, that's interesting. Yes, okay. Why do we want to measure the surface temperature of the Arctic or the Arctic region? And the answer is to study the reasons why there is this feature called Arctic amplification of climate change. And so what I'm going to talk about now is give a little bit of a background, problems of deriving SST skin from satellites. And as you all know, the skin is radiating in the infrared, and that gives the signal that satellites and other radiometers receive. But it is different from what you would get if you put a thermometer in the water, even at the depth of 1 millimeter. And that is because there's nearly always heat flow from the ocean, the atmosphere, and on the millimeter scales just below the interface, that is conducted heat, which requires a temperature gradient. I'm going to introduce what I still think as new developments, that is sail drones. In fact, they've been around for quite a long time now. And then summarize what are the issues with the Arctic atmosphere and future prospects. But before we move to the future, we should look back to see how we got to where we are. This is a very rare photograph of a lady called Eunice Foote, who was an amateur scientist and lived in upstate New York by the lakes. And she demonstrated that CO2 absorbs sunlight to raise the temperature more than just air, especially dry air. And she published her results in 1856. And because she was a lady scientist, she didn't present the results herself. She left that for her husband to do, who was also an amateur scientist, but a gentleman amateur scientist. And if you do a Google search on her name, you'll find lots of references to her being the godmother or the mother of greenhouse gas studies and global warming and so on. And that is a little bit of an exaggeration because she didn't show that. She showed that CO2 absorbs sunlight more efficiently than air. And so the temperature of the thermometer in her glass flasks rose more in the flask containing CO2 than the flask containing air. The fact that you feel the sun's rays, for instance, on a cold winter's day, and when the sun is shining and you turn your face to the sun, you feel the heat, the warmth. What Eunice showed is that it's not just surfaces that absorb solar radiation and feel warm, but also the atmosphere. It was 3 years later that John Tyndall, a very austere but august-looking gentleman here, who did some experiments in the infrared. And that is where greenhouse gas heating comes in. And this is his equipment. And he had a source of infrared, which was a metal box containing heated water. And the box radiated IR energy. And let me see about a pointer. In this tube, he could have gases flowing, and he could measure the amount of radiant energy that arrived at his detector, which I don't know what that was, but it could have been another box with water in and a thermometer in it. And he found that indeed CO2 was very effective at absorbing infrared radiation and raising its temperature, thereby decreasing the rate of temperature in the detector. And this is an interesting piece if you're interested in the very early stages of this sort of study. Fast forward to the end of the 1800s, and Svante Arrhenius, who was a professor of chemistry at the University of Stockholm, realized that there was a problem, or there was going to be a problem, caused by burning coal in those days. And he published a paper entitled "On the Influence of Carbonic Acid in the Air upon the Temperature of the Ground." And carbonic acid is a product of CO2 in the atmosphere, and CO2 in the atmosphere is a product of burning coal. And he argued that the Arctic would be the first area to reveal the effects of climate change. And he predicted that doubling atmospheric CO2 would lead to an average increase in global surface temperature that is within a factor of 2 of what the current models state. And this is remarkable. He didn't have computers. He didn't have radiative transfer models. He didn't have any atmospheric models. He had probably a slide rule and lots of paper and sharp pencils. Now, moving forwards, we have David Keeling here, who began taking daily measurements of CO2 concentration on the summit of Mount Mauna Loa in Hawaii. He was at Caltech, and he started measuring CO2 in the atmosphere just outside the lab, and he found it was very noisy, as you would imagine in the middle of a city with traffic. So he decided he needed to go to somewhere with a much cleaner atmosphere, and so he went to Point Reyes, which is a nice peninsula on California's coast. And he found that wasn't good enough either, because there was a strong wind direction dependency on his measurements. So he decided he'd have to go somewhere that was beyond the influence of local CO2 sources in cities or on surface of the ground. So he went to the top of Mauna Loa, which is, is in the middle of the Pacific, well away from any anthropogenic sources of CO2. So by the time it gets measured there, the CO2 has been well mixed through the atmosphere. Keeling died in 2005, and his measurements were continued and are still continued by Ralph Keeling, his son. And now there's a significant NOAA investment in equipment on Mauna Loa as well. So for a lot of both David Keeling and Ralph Keeling's work was at Scripps at the University of California, San Diego. And this is what they found. So this is what has now become known as the Keeling curve. And it starts in 1958 and carries up onto the present day. And when I checked late last night, the measurement was 422.11 parts per million, which is a significant increase. It's 100 parts per million since the start of his measurements. What is also delightful about this curve is this annual oscillation. And it shows that in the Northern Hemisphere, spring and summer, the atmospheric CO2 concentration decreases, only to increase again in the autumn, the fall, and the winter months. And this, of course, is the greening of the land in the Northern Hemisphere and the growth of plants and trees and grasses and so on is drawing down CO2 out of the atmosphere, only to release it when the leaves fall and degrade. But behind that annual cycle is an incessant increase. Now we can take Keeling's measurements and add them to longer term measurements taken from analysis of air bubbles in ice cores. So going back 10,000 years in the period of human development of civilization, we see that the Industrial Revolution caused a tremendous increase in atmospheric CO2. So, fair enough. Has the increase in atmospheric CO2 actually changed the surface temperature? And the answer, of course, as we all know, is yes, it did, and it will. And this is taken from a group called Berkeley Earth, which was set up in, I think, the early 90s when I was at Brookhaven, by a group of physicists at University of California, Berkeley, who wanted to do what they considered a much more rigorous analysis of the data than was being done by meteorologists and geophysicists, etc. And this idea was met with great acclaim by climate change skeptics. And when Berkeley Earth Group published their results, it was exactly the same as what had been predicted by, or that the growth had been measured and analyzed by all of the other groups active in this field. So here we have a compilation of land surface temperatures, which they have compiled from various meteorology measurements, and sea surface temperatures, which have been compiled by the UK Met Office Hadley Centre And as you see, the rate of change of temperature is quite remarkable. Is this due to CO2? Well, yes, going back to the Berkeley Earth analysis, this is what they have shown. So CO2 concentration is on the x-axis and global mean temperature is on the y-axis. And this comes from berkeleyearth.org. Don't worry about the values up here. These are projections, but this is real up to here. And when I was born sometime around here, the Earth's temperature has increased by a degree in my lifetime. That is really significant. But these are annual means. What about daily and monthly means? Well, this is daily sea surface temperatures taken or published by NOAA. And each line is a year. And this is the mean of the values between 1982 and 2011. And if the climate were not changing, we would expect 95% of the data to fall between +2 standard deviations and -2 standard deviations if the data were normally distributed. We don't see that. We see that the Earth is warming, as we knew. The orange line is last year's data, which caused a great deal of alarm, primarily because the oceans heated much more than was anticipated. The black line is this year's data up until the point when I took the data down from the web page shown at the bottom. And when I checked about a week ago, the line had not extended far because of the flooding in Asheville, where NOAA has its big data center. But even world, and this is between 60 north and south, even the daily average is still hiding a lot of information. This is the daily distribution a few years ago in January. And this is satellite based. And what I wanted to draw your attention to, even in the depths of the Northern Hemisphere winter, there is warm water in the Arctic. The Barents Sea north of Norway never freezes, and there's always open water to the west and north of Svalbard. On the Pacific side, we don't see that. The conditions, the temperature conditions on the Pacific side and the Atlantic side are very different. So, Arctic surface temperatures. The graph shows surface temperatures as annual means for 4 analyses. Again, Berkeley Earth is there. HADCRUTS is Hadley Center and the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia in the UK. GISTEMP is the Goddard Institute of Space Sciences in New York City. It's a NASA center, and this is their temperature analyses. ERA 5 is from the ECMWF in Europe. So the colored lines are the Arctic surface temperatures, and the straight lines are a fitted line to it. This rather drab line is the global rate of increase of surface temperature from all of these sources, and they lie over each other pretty well. The difference between the rate of change in the Arctic and in the globe is called the Arctic amplification of global change. And this has been known for decades. Here we have the temperature trend, and here we have the local amplification. And this I find really quite worrying in the Siberian seas, the Kara Sea and the Laptev Sea, where the surface temperatures are rising at a rate of about 6 times the global average. what is worrying here is that as I'm sure many of you know, the continental shelf extends quite a long way into the Arctic Ocean. It's shallow at about 50 meters depth or so, and contains a lot of methane hydrates, which, as the water warms, will be released into the atmosphere, and that is a very strong positive feedback for climate change. So, Arrhenius was correct. The Arctic is the first place to show the signature, the fingerprint of climate change. Now, all of those were surface measurements, which are very sparse. And so we really have to rely on satellite data now. Let me just remove the laser pointer. This is an animation which shows the path, the sub-satellite track of what's called a polar orbiting sun-synchronous satellite. It's polar orbiting because it goes quite close to the pole. It goes within the sub-satellite track goes within 8 degrees of the pole. And it takes 1 hour and 40 minutes to complete one orbit of the Earth. And in that time, the Earth is rotating to the east, so the sub-satellite tracks get displaced to the west. And if you were paying a lot of attention, you'd notice that when the satellite pops out from the Antarctica, it's in the same place. And so, as I said, the displacement is caused by the Earth's rotation. And they're called sun-synchronous because at any given point, the satellite appears to go overhead or within view at the same time of day. And there are 2 parts. There's an ascending part and a descending part. One will be in daylight, the other will be at nighttime. That's just the sub-satellite point. Where we get our information is from a series of imaging radiometers, which are scanning. And so they have a broad swath, thousands of kilometers wide, that takes a continuous set of data centered usually on the sub-satellite track. As we see, the convergence of these swaths is greatest over the polar regions. And the gaps there are simply because the swath of this instrument, which is called MODIS, which I'll refer to later on, isn't quite wide enough to overlap at the equator. So when one takes all of the high latitude data in the Arctic on a given day and mosaic them together, you get a picture like this. And this is really quite an unusual picture because it's so cloud-free, which is why I chose it. But this is all the polar ice. These are clouds. And we see dark open water north of Alaska. We don't see it so well coming north of Norway because it's cloudy. And clouds are a big problem because in the infrared, which is what we use to take surface temperatures, the radiation doesn't pass through clouds just as it doesn't in the visible part of the spectrum. So we have to identify clouds and remove them from the process of determining the surface temperature. So all well and good, but satellites take actually very, very accurate measurements in the visible and the infrared at the top of the atmosphere. Whoopee. What we want is the temperature at the bottom of the atmosphere. And the atmosphere, of course, is in the way. So to derive SST, we must first, as I said, remove all pixels which are contaminated by cloud radiances and correct for the effects of the intervening cloud-free atmosphere. And John Tyndall, I don't know how he worked this out, but in his experiments in his laboratory in London, he worked out that in the water vapor in the atmosphere, it was very effective at absorbing infrared radiation in some parts of the spectrum and much less effective elsewhere. So where the region is of the atmosphere is mostly transparent or less blocking than other parts of the spectrum, other wavelengths, he referred to these as atmospheric windows, which is a term we still use today in remote sensing. So specific to the Arctic, well, it's a very cloudy place, but it's also dry and the atmosphere is very cold. These are extremes, as you would imagine, in the global distribution of atmospheric temperature and humidity. So these are spectra at the top of atmospheric transmissivity. So when the value is close to 1, nearly all of the radiation at the wavelength shown at the bottom pass through the atmosphere and out to space, and the Earth is cooled. Where the value is close to 0, none of the emission from the sea surface or the land surface or even the tops of low clouds makes it out to space. This is one of Tyndall's atmospheric windows. And the 3 curves here are for a tropical atmosphere, a mid-latitude atmosphere, and an Arctic atmosphere. And we can see that there's, in many cases, a significant gradient in the transmissivity of the atmosphere with wavelength in this atmospheric window. So for as long as satellites capable of deriving sea surface temperatures, which is about 50 years now, the instruments have had 2 channels. They take measurements in 2 parts of this window, and so these are called split window measurements. And down here we have the spectral response functions of 2 of the MODIS infrared channels. And channel 31 is centered at a wavelength of about 11 microns and channel 32 at a wavelength of about 12 microns. And here are Planck's functions for emission at the temperatures shown, 0, 10, 20, and 30, which covers most of the oceanic surface temperature range. So what the instruments are measuring is Planck's function, modulated by the spectral response function of the instrument in the 2 channels, attenuated by the atmospheric transmission. So where there's a good gradient in the atmospheric transmission, the 12 micron temperature measured in space, and we call it a brightness temperature because we get it by inverting Planck's function with the knowledge of the spectral response function, is much cooler than at 11 microns. So if the temperature here measured at 11 microns were 2 degrees colder than the surface, and here the measurements were 3 degrees colder than the surface, you take the difference, multiply it by 2, add it to this measurement, and you've got to guess at the surface temperature. That's all there is, except it's not exactly that. These are some simulations I did a long time ago using a very accurate line-by-line radiative transfer model to compare moist summer mid-latitude atmosphere transmissivity. And the x-axis here is wave number, which is often used in radiative transfer. And it's the number of electromagnetic waves you can fit into a centimeter. So the units are centimeters to the -1. So this is at a wavelength at 1,000 wave numbers of 10 microns. And in the moist atmosphere, we see this gradient that we saw rather coarsely in the previous slide to what is called the water vapor continuum. In the dry atmosphere, where there's water vapor, but not very much, that gradient goes away. And that is a big problem. That is because the standard atmospheric correction algorithm, which has been around for many years now, is called the nonlinear sea surface temperature atmospheric correction algorithm, and is due to Charlie Walton, who retired many years ago. So this is the atmospheric correction algorithm we use for MODIS. The gray terms you don't have to worry about because those are to correct for specific instrumental artifacts that have crept through the NASA Goddard processing to give brightness temperatures. So it's a linear combination of the brightness temperature measured at 11 microns plus brightness temperature difference between the 11 and 12 micron measurements, and then another term with secant theta to the -1, where theta is the satellite zenith angle measured at the ground to take into account the effects of increasing path length as this scan goes from nadir, can I do this, to the edge of the swath. So the path length increases. And this is simple geometry, and it assumes that the radiative transfer process is linear with distance, and it's not. But the coefficients which multiply each of the terms are derived from very, very large databases now, many, many millions of so-called matchups between satellite measurements through a cloud-free atmosphere to a surface measurement, and most of these are drifting buoys. So we see that the whole of the information in the state of the atmosphere is in this single term, B11 minus B12. If it becomes very small, then the measurement errors become a large part of it. It could even be zero, and there are cases where it can change sign. So this is a real issue. So this is where we have to focus our attention. So we apply this algorithm, and the coefficients are based on 9 zones around the globe and each month of the year. So we try to account for the regional and seasonal changes in the Earth's atmosphere that way. But how well does it perform? So we compare with other in situ measurements that are taken within 10 minutes and within 12 kilometers of the satellite measurement. Usually this distance is less than 1 or less than 2. And it means the measurement is in a particular pixel in the satellite image, satellite data set. Most temperature comparisons are made with in situ measurements from drifting or moored buoys. And here we have a distribution of those in June of this year. So this is in the height of summer, and look how few data points there are in the Arctic. There are other places where the oceans are poorly sampled, and where there are linear lines, such as here. That's the Toga Tau array of moorings. And the gap of the drifters is that there's divergence from the equator to the gyres, which is where the drifters go to die. So no matter how many drifters you put in the equatorial region, they all drift to the poles or towards the pole. Right, so those are subsurface temperatures. If we could measure a radiation, the radiated emission from a ship using an accurate infrared radiometer, we could make a like with like comparison. And that would remove the additional uncertainties caused by the effects of diurnal heating between the skin of the ocean and the measurement at which the buoy temperature is made, and the variability in the surface skin effect. But these ships, and we've been putting them on ships since the mid-90s, they rarely go into the Arctic. Now, a new development, I like to call it a new development, but they've been around for over 10 years, so they're not that new, is to use autonomous surface vehicles such as sail drones. But before we go into that, how do we get a skin sea surface temperature from a ship measurement? Well, we put a radiometer on the side of a ship looking ahead of the bow wave, which means the radiometer is in a very vulnerable position regarding storms and rain and so on. And we point it at the sea surface. And what it measures is the sum of the emission of the sea surface, L surf, which contains the information through Planck's equation and the emissivity of the SST skin, but it's added to by emission from the atmosphere in the layer of the atmosphere between the instrument and the surface. And more importantly, there's a reflected component, LREF, which is the reflected infrared emission from the atmosphere. So to obtain L surf from the sea-looking measurements, we have to correct for L atmosphere and L down. And for radiometers mounted close to the sea surface, non-sail drones, they're less than a meter away. On research ships, they're about 6 meters, and on cruise ships, big cruise ships where we also take these measurements, they're about 30 meters from the sea surface. You cannot ignore the layer of the atmosphere in that case. So for sail drones, we can neglect the atmospheric emission, and the difference between the measured sky radiance made by pointing the radiometer up at the same angle as downwards to make the correction. But we do need to know accurate emissivity values and reflectivity, which is 1 minus emissivity. Okay, on to sail drones. These are 2 or 3 sail drones at Dutch Harbour, about to start a 150-day deployment in the Arctic from Dutch Harbour in the summer. This is in May 2019. 2 sail drones, SD-1036, sail drone 1036 and 1037, were deployed with infrared radiometers on the deck. And this is their track. And these are the radiometers. So after very careful QCing of the data, we find we can derive a skin temperature from sail drone measurements with an RMS difference of about 0.12 K, which is much, much better than I anticipated. And it means that they can be used for scientific applications. There's a well-known wind speed dependency of the temperature drop across the skin layer, and the sail drone measurements, which are shown in black here as this data, are from the sail drones. The others are from ships from various investigators. And this is written up in this paper. The sail drones are 7 meters long. The hull is 7 meters long. The top of the sail, which is a rigid sail, is 4.5 meters above the waterline, and beneath the hull is a keel which extends 2 meters down, which is also instrumented. Using them is not without challenges in the Arctic. There are cameras on the head of the mast, and here we have a picture of sail drone 1036 nudging the ice. Wasn't supposed to, but it just happened. So what is it measuring? Could be very shallow water that's liquid. There could be some ice in the field of view. But from the point of view of comparing with satellites, it doesn't really matter, because it was a very cloudy day. Well, cloudy when these measurements were taken. So the cameras also tell us when the instruments are being rained on or snowed on, when there's spray from heavy seas, as well as proximity to ice. What do we get? Well, this is MODIS on Aqua, one of NASA's Earth Observing System satellites, and MODIS on Terra. And the data for SD-1036 and SD-1037 are shown there. So we get about 400 matchups in the course of 150 days, which actually is not bad given how cloudy the Arctic is. But if we look at the mean and the median, we see a huge difference in the values measured by 1036 and 1037. The values we get from 1036 are what we would expect or would really desire. 1037 is a bit embarrassing. And why should they be different? Because when they're close together, say within a kilometer of each other, the values are essentially the same, very, very small differences. So are the differences due to spatial separation? If we look at the variance, the standard deviation and the robust standard deviation, the values aren't all that different between the two sets of measurements. So there's something going on with the measurements of Saildra and 1037, which is not happening with 1036. And it is caused by separation. This is the cruise track again, and you can see at times they were sailing very close together, trying to avoid being blown into Russian territorial waters. But there are times when they're separated by tens to hundreds of kilometers. Does this matter? Well, when we look at MIRA-2, the analysis data, and MIRA is a NASA reanalysis data set standing for Modern Era Retrospective Analysis for Research and Applications version 2. MIRA is easier. We see that the profiles of temperature on the right and humidity, where we have matchups between MODIS on the two satellites and the two sail drones, are somewhat different, especially very close to the surface. There are inversions in humidity and inversions in temperature that are different. Could that be the cause of the difference in the success in the atmospheric correction algorithm? Because we know it's not an error with the measurements from the drones, because when they're close together, the measurements are essentially the same. Next step. Is this local to where we were operating, or is it wider in the Arctic? Are inversions common in the Arctic? The answer is yes. There are lots of papers in the literature saying how common they are. Do inversions have seasonal and spatial variations? To find the answer, we examined 20 years of MODIS matchups with drifting buoys in the Arctic, north of 60 degrees. And this is what we found. The top is the time series as a density plot, colored by density, of the difference between the buoy measurements and the satellite retrievals. And in great, well, what can one say? These satellites have been operating for 20 years now, more than 20 years. They had a 5-year planned lifetime, and it's an incredible credit to the instrument physicists and engineers who designed and built them, that they're still working 20 years later. Down here we have the differences between the satellite measurements and the buoy measurements. Two things to note. On the Pacific side, there are very, very fewer data points than on the Atlantic side. If we restrict the comparisons to extreme deviations to be greater than 2 degrees or less than -2 degrees, we find the greater than 2 degrees have a concentration in the Pacific side, and the less than 2 degrees have a concentration on the Atlantic side. We're looking at here 390,000 data points in those 20 years, and they're nearly all on the Atlantic side, for the reason that I showed earlier, that the Barents Sea and the Northern Norwegian Sea never freeze. So the gross statistics over this 20-year period are not too bad. They're not as good as we would like. Globally, these numbers are less than 1/10 of a degree. Quality level 0 is the highest quality of the satellite retrieval, and we have confidence in the cloud screening. Quality level 1 is the same, but it's where the secant theta -1 term has grown, so the atmospheric path length is greater, and we would expect a degradation in the accuracy, and we see that. And the robust standard deviations are always better than the standard deviations, which means there are outliers in the distribution. As a reminder, these are the Aqua sail drone statistics. And if we look at the total, i.e. combining 1036 and 1037, we get numbers which are not that different from over here. So yes, this is an issue with inversions. And the error in the derived SST comes from anomalous, let's say, brightness temperature differences, the difference between the 11 and 12 micron measurement. And here is the distribution day and night of those data that I showed earlier. And we see that there are a significant number in the day, simply because there are more daytime measurements in the polar summer that are less than 0. These are definitely anomalous. And we define anomalous as being less than 0.036 degree, because that is the contribution of the uncertainties in the satellite measurements. So is this really caused by inversions? Remember this distribution. So we looked at this 20-year time series from MERA 2, and the anomalous distributions with marked near surface temperature and humidity inversions are in red. The non-anomalous, let's call them normal, brightness temperature difference are through atmospheres colored blue. So it does look as though the anomalous air temperatures are rigorously related to, or strongly related to, the presence of inversions. If we break it up around the year, we see that this separation is generally present, but the presence of inversions is more dominant in the summer months. So this is air temperature and this is humidity. This shows the relative proportion of all of the matchups that are taken when there is no atmospheric inversion in a normal, in the green, where there's temperature inversion in blue, humidity inversion in red, and where there are both in yellow. The left-hand plot shows for the normal atmosphere, and there are inversions, and the numbers are the percentages for the dominant type of atmosphere. But on the right, this is where we have anomalous atmospheres. The presence of inversions is quite convincing. Practically all of the data going from April through to October, where there are anomalous brightness temperatures measured in space, have a temperature and humidity inversion. Where we have normal brightness temperature differences, there are inversions, but the discrepancy with and without inversions is much less marked. So, breaking up the Atlantic and the Pacific sectors in this matchup database, we see again that the blue is the Atlantic and the Pacific is in red, and the separation is variable around the year, but most pronounced in June in the warm months. Same for humidity, more wintertime inversions in the Atlantic sector than in the Pacific sector. And again, the same for breaking down Atlantic and Pacific. More summertime inversions in the Atlantic, in the Pacific. So what about the accuracy differences? Whoops, not so fast. This is the Atlantic sector and the Pacific sector. And it would seem that Pacific sector, the MODIS atmospheric retrieval algorithm is performing much, much better than in the Atlantic sector. But as we know, the Pacific sector includes many more retrievals through anomalous atmospheres. So we're getting it right, but for the wrong reasons. The standard atmosphere, the normal atmosphere, much more prevalent in the Atlantic sector, is producing these large biases, mean and median. And in the Pacific sector, they're very small. So the effect of the temperature inversion is to counteract the error in the retrieval through a normal atmosphere. That's not very encouraging. And this is the same information presented as box whisker charts of the monthly values for the Atlantic and the Pacific. So why are we doing all of this? Well, as I said at the outside, we want knowledge of the surface temperatures to better understand the causes of Arctic amplification. In situ measurements are very, very difficult because of the hostile nature of the Arctic. Satellite remote sensing, it provides the only way of getting large-scale, repeated, frequent measurements of surface temperature, especially the sea surface. And the convergence of orbits of polar orbiting sun-synchronous satellites produces good high-latitude satellite sampling. The challenges are the atmospheric correction, as I've shown, is based on the brightness temperature differences. And in the Arctic, these can be very small or negative. Inversions are instrumental, but not uniquely so, in causing large anomalous brightness temperature difference, which propagates through the retrieval algorithm to errors in the retrieval. The inversions have a noted seasonal and regional variation, which means we don't have the option of just adding another term or another two terms to the retrieval algorithm. We've got to do something which is smarter. And we have to do a regional algorithm as well, one for the Atlantic, one for the Pacific. And the difficulties in taking surface measurements there are difficulties that there are difficulties in taking the surface measurements that we need to derive the algorithms and to assess their accuracy. Now, I haven't addressed here that the role of the surface emissivity becomes important when the atmosphere is very dry. The variable air-sea temperature difference also becomes important when the atmosphere is very dry. Ice crystals suspended in the atmosphere also interact with infrared radiation and can be important. The future prospects are to improve the NLSST, but we need ancillary information, such as from MIRA, to provide the information required. This means we cannot do near real-time Arctic retrievals to good accuracy from infrared radiometers on satellites. But in the future, EUMETSAT is going to launch METIMAGE about a year from now, which is essentially a super MODIS. And we need much more infrared radiation measurements at the surface from sail drones. I haven't mentioned microwave radiometers. We can get sea surface temperature from them, but the antennas are what's called diffraction limited, which means the size of the antenna is only a small multiple of the wavelength being measured. And so the spatial resolution is poor. It's about 50 by 75 kilometers. You will see microwave SSTs on a grid of 25 kilometers, but it means the data are oversampled. And they have side lobe issues where radiation is received in coastal regions, for example, from the land. and that has proven impossible or very, very difficult to correct. The Europeans are going to launch the Copernicus imaging microwave radiometer, which will have a 6-meter antenna, and that produces its own challenges. The first to be launched in 2029 and the second in 2035. And that should give sea surface temperatures in the Arctic with a 15-kilometer resolution. And that is much more interesting. Lots of funding from NASA primarily. NASA Goddard and NASA JPL do a lot of the heavy lifting for us in the processing. STAR produce quality control drifter and mooring data. Otis Brown and Bob Evans, who some of you may know, led the effort in the early days of MODIS. And then there are a number of people at Rasmus and elsewhere who have all contributed to the work that I've shown here, especially Chong Jia, who was my grad student, and now he's doing a very short postdoc to wrap things up. These are the references. You can see Chong's name there. Thank you. And questions?
Yeah, okay, Peter, thank you for the sort of taking us from the historical up to the present cutting edge questions. The question I have, and maybe you spoke to it, but I don't think I could answer it, is why the difference between the 1036 and the 1037, and can you trust either of them?
You can trust both of them. Let me see if I can go back to the relevant slide. It's because they operated in slightly different areas in the Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Sea and south of Bering Strait during these deployments. Sorry, this is taking time because it's big. I think it's coming up soon. Right. They both left Dutch Harbor on the same day, and they both tracked each other through the Bering Strait up to about here, and then their tracks diverged. So in this region, their measurements agree very well. Here, I forget which sail drone went off because it had come south rather more quickly than the other. So it spent time over to the west here, south of St. Lawrence Island. Up here, we have one sail drone in the Beaufort Sea, the other in the Chukchi Sea. And so the cause for the difference is that the atmospheres were different. And over here, I forget which now, actually, one of them has far more inversions in the atmosphere than the other. And can we trust them? Yes. The black line, oh, I lost my pointer. There it is. The black line. Well, first of all, the colored dots are the density of measurements in the sail drone deployments from both sail drones. So there are 4,257 data points there. And the black line is a fitted curve for an exponential wind speed dependence. Donlan Craig Donlan collated a lot of radiometer data from ships in the early 2000s, compiled them into a large data set and did a wind speed dependence. And he came up with the dark red curve. Zhuin Zhang from Australia did the blue curve, and that's from shipboard radiometers. Donlan is from shipboard radiometers, and the Minnett line there is from our super accurate hyperspectral instrument, and they all, especially at high wind speeds, agree the intercept at high wind speeds is within 20 millikelvin. And that wouldn't be possible to include the sail drones if they weren't accurate.
Okay, and I probably jumped on my question before stating my great enthusiasm about the approach. I think this is nifty, and I don't know what's involved and what the cost is and who pays for it, but I think it's kind of an exciting approach, and let me add my applause to that before asking my question as to why they differ.
Okay.
And the fact that they converge up there at the high wind speed, I think you make a persuasive point there. Okay, let me open it up for questions. I don't quite know how to do this. I think if somebody unmutes him or herself and says something, then they'll get a green box around their mouth, and I can their face, and I can recognize them. So let's give that a shot. Not seeing anybody.
Well, while people are thinking about it, I can answer some of your questions. NASA provided the funding for these sail drone deployments, and they did for 2 more summers, not as long, but they went north in 2021. 2020 was cancelled because of COVID restrictions. 2021 they sailed, and 2022, but neither of those deployments had the ship radiometers, much to my dismay. And
Okay.
Sail Drone doesn't sell them, they lease them out, and the going rate, if I remember correctly, is $2,500 a day per vehicle.
Not bad. I like the idea. Okay.
Compared to the cost of a ship.
I see Kamazima's got his hand up.
Yeah, Peter, thank you very much. Sorry.
My pleasure. Nice to see you again.
Yes, great to see you. It's been a while. I really enjoyed this talk, I must say. And I learned a lot. I thought I knew quite a bit, and you showed that I don't know that much. So
don't worry, neither do I.
So with these differences, you did kind of allude to that. How much of an impact does it have on the Arctic amplification in terms of the?
Okay. Thus far, nobody has used satellite data to study the Arctic amplification. The graph that I showed, and I won't waste people's time by going back to it, from the Berkeley Earth Project, that was all in situ measurements. And the in situ measurements are very sparse. So some of what you saw north of the Arctic Circle is the product of a data interpolation algorithm. But the data of the Siberian Arctic, which showed 6 times the global rate of Arctic amplification, those are taken from ships. And there are a lot of ships up there. I've had 3 icebreaker cruises in that area on Russian icebreakers before things turned sour. And the heating there is caused largely by the runoff from the large Siberian rivers. And the warm water that keeps the Barents Sea ice-free doesn't progress eastwards along the continental shelf. It dives down through a canyon called the Santa Ana Trough. And so it then settles at mid-latitude, at mid-depth in the Arctic Ocean. And the fresher water on top is cooler, and it prevents the heat from the Atlantic layer from melting the ice underneath. So thus far, all of the Arctic amplification studies have used in situ measurements or models. And as far as I know, no one has bitten the bullet and looked for the signal in satellite-derived SSTs. And what I've shown today is that the algorithms, the nonlinear SST algorithm, doesn't do a very good job in the challenging Arctic atmosphere. So maybe people are wise not to do this until we have sorted out an atmospheric correction algorithm that can account for the effects of inversions and the other things that I mentioned, like anomalous air sea temperature differences and the effect of the surface emissivity variations.
So can I ask a follow-up, a very quick follow-up?
Of course.
If we depend on the ship data, obviously there's a lot of very long range interpolation there, right? So what we see is not quite real.
Well, I wouldn't say it's not real. There are measurements. The ships do deploy some buoys, some drifters when they're up there. There were some dots in the June distribution of this year. Aircraft deploy ice buoys which sit on the surface of the ice, and they measure the ice surface temperature and the air temperature above the ice. And when the ice melts, or they're taken out of the Arctic on what's called the transpolar ice drift, and then out through Fram Strait into the East Greenland current, they then become oceanic drifters. Some of them, of course, don't survive the grinding as the ice breaks up. So it's not that it's made up data. It's simply that the data are sparse. Not wrong. And in the north of the Siberian coast and the Siberian shelf, that is a shipping lane that opens up in the summer. I don't know if people are using it now since relations with Russia have soured so badly, but at once there's a lot of shipping coming from the Pacific to European ports, because it's a much, much shorter track, also to the northeast ports of the US and Canada. And these ships will be taking measurements. Many of them are report surface temperature measurements to their local or their home meteorological center. And so the data are incorporated in what the Berkeley Earth analysis showed. Oh, the actual climate amplification, the Arctic amplification, was from a paper by Rantanen et al. So it's not wrong, but we're not getting a lot of the details simply because the data are so sparse.
Thank you.
Okay, let me try to wrap this up unless anybody's got some sort of burning question. If you were here in person, what we would have you do is, well, first we would offer you some lunch, and then we would have you meet with the graduate students and postdocs to ask questions of either scientific substance or career development. Let me, I'm sure you'll agree to it, extend the invitation to students and postdocs if they want to reach you, they know how to find you, and extend an email to you and initiate a conversation that way. And that said, let us thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Peter.
I wish I could do more because I know so little. I understand so little, put it that way. So thank you for your attention.